All right, why don't we get started? Oh. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I think it's about time we get underway. I know Senator Watson is in transit, but he won't be here for another 25 minutes. And sure is good to see everybody here today. I will officially call this our 142nd meeting of the Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations to order, and I detect a quorum. Without objection, we'll dispense with the calling of the roll. And as our first order of business, welcome everybody in the audience here today. Also, we'll take up the minutes from the meeting of May 2017 behind tab 1. Thank you, Mr. McMahon. Thank you. Been properly moved and seconded. Are there any questions or concerns about these minutes? Seeing, hearing none. All in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed or abstaining? All right, the minutes of May 2017 are approved as submitted. Behind tab 2, time for Dr. Lippard's update. Cliff?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The first update is, and all the members have already been made aware of this, but unfortunately, Mayor Tom Rowland has, for personal reasons, resigned from the commission effective August 3rd, 2017. I'm sure you all feel the same way I do, that we're going to greatly miss the vice chairman. He's been a fantastic member. He's been a member of the commission since 1995 and has served as vice chairman since 2002. He's represented the commission on a number of outside panels, including some work with the Tennessee Emergency Communications Board. So we had talked about electing the vice chair at this meeting, but we're going to wait until his position is filled and we have a full membership. So that we'll be having an election most likely for that at our December meeting. I'm going to actually, Mr. Chairman, if it's okay with you, I'm going to turn over to you for the next item.
Oh, yes, the next item. Oh, is this your update? Oh, my update. See how quickly we forget. Oh, I see. Oh, that, I don't want to talk about that. So there may be some transition beyond just the vice chair's role. And let me say, I'm in case Mayor Rowland is listening, and if he has as much sense as I know he does, he's probably not. But we're going to miss him terribly. I already do. We thought about draping the chair here today, with some kind of crepe, but it's not that bad. Tom has explained that it's just hard for him to drive those distances. It's a back issue, as I understand. So I'm talking a little bit more out of school than I normally would, because we don't have some grim news about Mayor Rowland. He's just got the sense to say, after doing this since, for 22 years, he just would rather stay home than make that trek, and we certainly respect that, but we will miss him. I see what Cliff has written here. Yes, that there's stuff about my future might be changing, but the commission was recently recognized, I think this is very important, for outstanding public policy achievement by a group called the Governmental Research Association for tangible improvements in government made possible in part by our municipal boundaries in Tennessee, Annexation and Growth Planning Report. And to receive this kind of national recognition, I think, is a big deal. And if I had it within my power to get each of you a certificate on that, and I may still somehow to share with you, because all of you did a lot of heavy lifting in that report for us to have received this national recognition. And so each and every one of you and all together collectively are to be commended for that. Would you like me to turn it back over to you now, Cliff? Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So on the second page of tab 2 on updates, we have a request from the Department of Health. They're doing a work group looking at their fluoridation initiative, fluoride in water, and they've asked for the commission to appoint a designee to assist on this work group. It's got a pretty short timeline, and we think we could be of some assistance possibly in helping them and evaluate, using our our experience in analyzing issues, somewhat similar issues, analyzing the benefits and costs of their program. But with a short timeline, I'm not sure we could really contribute or give it justice. What we thought might be a better option would be for the working group, if they so desire, to ask the legislature to seek a TACIR study on the issue next session, so we could actually give it the time that we like to give these types of complex issues. It doesn't really require any action on part of the commission unless you would like us to go ahead and appoint a representative at this time.
Cliff asked me about it, obviously, when it came up, and I thought the option he's described to be probably the best on that, unless you all disagree. But very well.
And then one other commission update is just what the staff would like to proceed with adding a GIS component to our public infrastructure needs inventory, which would allow our contract staff from the development districts, as they're entering projects, to put in longitude, latitude information on the projects. We just think this has a lot of potential benefits for future analysis of the work, and I think will make it a more useful product for local officials and for legislators when they're looking at information. And it gives us the potential in the long term to provide a lot more interactive information on our website as well. We think we can do this mostly with in-house staff within existing resources, though we would have to bring a contractor on board for a little bit of the initial work. This is someone we've worked with in the past, and we believe we could do that for under $500. So with the commission's approval, we'd like to proceed on that.
Any objection? Sounds like a good idea. No objection.
Okay, and then we have one staff update. I guess it's the day for farewells. Unfortunately, Ethel Detch, who has been with us for quite some time as a senior research consultant, these are the part-time experts that we bring in after they retire from other positions after fruitful careers. We bring them in for their expertise on various issues. Ethel's been a part-time consultant with us for 9 years, and before coming to work with us, she was a state employee for 30 years, and culminating with her serving as the executive director of the Offices of Research and Education Accountability in the Comptroller's Office. So Ethel has retired again, and we had a nice reception for her at the office a couple of weeks ago, and the chairman signed a certificate that we're going to present to her when she gets back from her whirlwind vacation. She's traveling today and won't be able to be with us, but if you could just join me in thanking Ethel remotely for her years of service.
Thank you, Dr. Lippard. Behind tab 3, now we will take up the Fiscal Federalism web project. An update. Mark is here, and give us an update. Probably a good thing to do before Senator Watson gets here. You know, he's probably within 9 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Mark McAdoo. I'm managing the research project on fiscal federalism for TACIR. When this project was presented to the Commission in May, the Commission asked staff to look at 3 items. First, to provide tax collection information by county, to crosswalk our data with the state budget, and to provide local data in per capita dollars. And I'm happy to report that we've accomplished all 3 of these tasks. And I know that commission members had the opportunity to look at the website before the commission meeting, but I'd like to review these improvements quickly. But before I do, I'd like to acknowledge these improvements would not have been possible without the help of the Comptroller's Office and the Department of Revenue. And I would also like to acknowledge the contributions of David Thurman in the State Budget Office and Dr. Meg Streams with TSU. So many thanks for their assistance on this project. So this may not be the best view of the website, but hopefully you'll be able to get a gist of it since you've already had an opportunity to take a look at it. Of course, there would be no intergovernmental funding without taxes, so we've provided federal, state, and tax collection and local tax collection information. Looking first at the federal tax information, we found that in 2015, the IRS collected $62.7 billion in total federal taxes from Tennesseans. But the most current federal tax collection data that's available by county was the 2014 federal income tax data. So the data is presented both in total dollars and in per capita dollars. As you can see here, I won't drill down into the website. And we present this information for the years 2011 through 2014. County level data is not available for other federal taxes, including things like corporate income tax, excise tax, and other federal taxes. But we were able to provide the income tax information. Looking next at the state data, the Tennessee Department of Revenue provides detailed information on state taxes through their website, and for convenience, TACIR has summarized revenues tax data for the years 2011 through 2015. And we present, again, this information in both total dollars and per capita dollars. And then finally, for the local tax information, the Tennessee Comptroller of the Treasury collects information on county taxes, and summaries of this tax information is presented here by county for the years 2011 through 2015. We did not include city-level tax data, except for those counties that, like Davidson County, that are countywide. Municipal governments, I'm sorry. This information is, for cities, is available on the Comptroller's website, but you have to look at the individual city audits, and we haven't included that information. So that's what we have for you on taxes. Going back to the main website, we were also asked to crosswalk our data with the state budget, and we used 2015 data because this is the year that had the most, this is the most current year that had complete data for all of our funding categories that we were looking at the federal level. So there are some mismatches between data sets that are provided in state fiscal year versus federal fiscal year, but I'll walk you through this information provided on the crosswalk. We found that in federal fiscal year 2015, $69.4 billion in federal funds entered the state of Tennessee through 4 pathways. $51.6 billion in direct payments and benefits to individuals, $5.2 billion in intergovernmental grants, $6.2 in salaries to federal employees and military personnel based in Tennessee, and $6.4 billion in federal contracts performed in the state of Tennessee. Of the $69.2 billion, only $12.1 billion flowed through the state budget, and the remaining $57.3 billion in federal funds that entered the state entered through one of the other pathways. I would like to point out that this $12.1 billion that you would normally see paralleled in the state budget, we included some of the information for Medicare and Medicaid in our website under the individuals program area because they're the ultimate beneficiaries of these funds. So if that looks like a discrepancy, that's what's going on there. And then we provided this table. I thought it was going to be a little bit bigger. Apologize, that's difficult to see. But what we've done here in this crosswalk table is we have started with the line items in the state budget that include federal funding, and we have compared that with the most comparable category on our website and shown the total amounts for each one and the difference. And then in the far right-hand column, though it's difficult to see and impossible to read, we've provided an explanation for why we feel like these discrepancies exist. Now, we couldn't just use the funding information from the state budget because we wanted to present information at the county level, and of course the state budget doesn't do that. So we had to rely on other sources like the Bureau of Economic Analysis or USA Spending, and there's some disconnect that's introduced by using these other sources. And additionally, there's a disconnect between state fiscal year and federal fiscal year as well. So for each one of these categories, we attempt to explain why we feel like the data is somewhat of a mismatch, but still accurate. And then finally, I'd like to demonstrate the county area profiles. And I'd like to point out that this is one of the items that staff feels like is the greatest contribution of this web resource, because this feature is the only resource on the internet that allows users to generate a profile of intergovernmental funding by county quickly and easily. So as requested, we have summarized this information not only in total dollars, but in per capita dollars. And the we'll just look at one. The entire website is built out, but we'll look at Shelby County, I guess. And you can see that you can go to per capita reports or county total dollar reports. And we present the information in graphs at the top of the report for an easy comparison with the state funding for each one of these categories in per capita dollars, and then we present the individual county information. And then in the body of the report, we provide detailed information, in this one per capita dollars, in the other version in total dollars, depending on what the user might want. There's some limited city information available in this report, but for detailed city information, really the comptroller's website is probably the best resource for that in the city audits. So what we expect to do in the next stages is to update this website annually as time and resources allow, and we will continue to make incremental improvements to the website, again, as time and resources allows. And that concludes my presentation, but I'll be happy to take questions or receive comments.
Questions for Brother McAdoo? You mentioned the comptroller's office. We get mailings from the comptroller's office. Ms. Spires, I know, is here representing Comptroller Wilson. They recently sent a mailing about federalism, fiscal federalism, to coordinate there. And also, I think it's the Council of State Governments that has something on their website about the same subject. And if you could just make a note to try to connect those dots, I'd like them to know, if they could hear from you, that we've got this website so that others could link to our work product as well as them.
Of course.
All right, then. Good work.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Okay, then we're going to move on to tab 4. I'm going to get into a little additional heavy lifting here now in the next 2 reports. The 911 system functionality and funding adequacy. This is a final report for our approval. And to present today is Jennifer Berry.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the Commission. Today I'm presenting for Commission approval the final report, Tennessee's 911 system functionality and funding adequacy, found in tab 4. In response to your questions and suggestions when we presented the draft report at the May meeting, we added some information and analyses to the final report. The suggested recommendations are bolded on pages 3 through 11, and the additions to the draft are shaded gray throughout the report. The Commission is required to report its conclusions to the Joint Committee on Government Operations on or before September 15th, 2017. As you may recall, the report was required by Public Chapter 795, Acts of 2014, which replaced the 911 funding system that relied on a combination of state and local fees to fund 911 services with a flat statewide fee of $1.16 on all types of telecommunications telecommunications services that connect to 911. The Act also established a new method for distributing funds to the 100 emergency communications districts. A copy of the Act is included as Appendix A on page 61. It also directed the Commission to study 9 questions addressing consolidation, Tennessee Emergency Communications Board, or the TECB membership, telecommunications service providers registration, and service interruption reporting requirements, and funding. At the May meeting, I described our findings and responses to each of the 9 questions, which start on page 1. I won't do that again during this presentation, but I will give you a quick overview highlighting the changes and additions to the draft report and the 2 suggested recommendations, which are the same as the draft version with one small clarification. The final report includes fiscal year 2016 audit data for all 100 districts, summarized in tables 1 and 2 on pages 35 and 36. And the data for each district is in the appendices H and I on pages 101 and 105. The data shows 33 districts with a negative change in net position when including depreciation in all revenue sources. Of the 33, 16 had their first year of negative change in net position, 13 had their second consecutive year, and 4 had their third consecutive year. Under Tennessee law, districts with 3 consecutive years of negative change in net position, as shown by their annual audits, are considered distressed and are subject to evaluation and supervision by the TECB. The TECB reviewed the 4 districts that had 3 consecutive years of negative change in 2016, and after removing the depreciation expense from the evaluation, the TECB designated all 4 not distressed. The draft report included audit data for 97 of the 100 districts. In response to questions from Commission members at the last meeting, we added some analyses and information to the final report. We expanded the analysis of 4 alternative funding distribution methods, including distributing all the revenue based on call volume or population, or maintaining the current base distribution while distributing any excess revenue based on call volume or population. Under these models, a few district distribution amounts would have increased, but most would have decreased. For example, on page 38, using a hypothetical model based on call volume to distribute the total revenue districts received in fiscal year 2016 from both base and excess distributions, shows revenue in only 11 districts would increase. And of the total revenue increase for these 11, the Shelby and Davidson County districts combined would receive 88%. The distribution amounts to the other 89 districts would decrease. A hypothetical scenario that distributes just the excess amount based on call volume without changing the fiscal year 2016 base amounts also shows that the same 11 districts would receive more than what they actually received that year, while the other 89 would receive less. We added Appendix J on page 109, showing the comparison of the amounts distributed to each district using the current distribution method and each of the 4 alternative methods that we looked at. In response to a question at the last meeting about resetting or adjusting the base distribution amounts, which are fixed using 2012 revenue numbers, we added a hypothetical scenario on page 39, using an inflation index to adjust the base distribution amounts to January 2017 dollars. We found that increasing the base amounts using inflation or some other method, in effect, eliminates the available excess revenue and could potentially lead to a shortfall statewide, a revenue shortfall statewide, if the rate is not increased as well. This is because the revenue that had been used for excess distributions would be the funding source for this increase in the base distribution. The final report addresses concerns expressed at the last meeting about the transition to Next Generation 911, or NG 911, specifically relating to social media, texting, and training, and that information is on pages 49 through 50. Guidelines and standards are being developed by the Federal Communications Commission, or the FCC, the National Emergency Number Association, NENA, and the Association of Public Safety Communications Officials, called APCO, to help districts adapt to NG 911 and train employees to handle text messages and other new forms of communication. The TECB is also providing support through training regulations, a training advisory committee, and training courses. We added some questions and answers about text to 911 from NENA as Appendix M on page 125, and TECB's dispatch training regulations as Appendix N on page 127. We also added a little more detail about district and PSAP consolidation in Tennessee, and a little more about consolidation efforts in other states on pages 19 and 20. And to address the issues of how 911 revenue can be used and how to pay for dispatch, we emphasized TECB's revenue standards a bit more in the final report, although the draft did discuss and include the standards as an appendix. In the final report, the revenue standards are included as Appendix K on page 113. The TECB created the revenue standards in 2003. They outline required, permissible, and prohibited uses of 911 revenue. Districts are allowed to pay for dispatch, but only after they meet all required expenses, such as paying for equipment. The final report emphasizes that among both national and state-level stakeholders, views on who should pay for dispatch vary, and the report clarifies that both MTAS and CTAS take the position that 911 fees should not pay for dispatch, and both those organizations encourage and support agreements between districts and local governments to pay for dispatch. The first of the two suggested recommendations is on page 5. It addresses service interruption reporting requirements for telecommunications service providers. Currently, service providers are required to report service disruptions to the FCC, but not to the state. Because the TECB would be able to better assist emergency communications districts when interruptions occur, if they knew about them sooner, telecommunications service providers should be required to notify the TECB when there are service disruptions. And this recommendation is the same as the draft version. The second suggested recommendation on page 10 relates to funding distribution. Building on a recommendation from the Commission's 2006 911 report, the TECB could tie the distribution of any additional revenue generated by rate increases to a standard set of cost components, similar to the state's basic education program funding formula known as the BEP. The cost components for providing a minimum standard of 911 services could be developed with input from the existing TECB operations and technical committees using minimum technical operating standards, and they should be reviewed regularly. The method would determine and distribute funding to emergency communications districts, but districts would still have flexibility with spending as long as they meet the minimum technical operating standards. This distribution method would only apply to excess revenue above the base amount generated by a rate increase. And then the final report, we just clarified this recommendation a bit by specifying that this method would only apply to excess revenue and not to the base amounts. The report does not recommend a change to the amount of the rate. And that concludes my presentation. I welcome your comments, and I'll address any questions you have. Thank you.
Questions? Mayor Waters, usually. No? Yeah. Take it away. I've learned a thing or two in my...
Is it my understanding, and I may have misunderstood, but did you said the report contained that MTAS and CTAS oppose using any 911 funds for any aspect of dispatch? Is that
Yeah, their position is that the funds should not be used for dispatch, and that's why they encourage those local agreements to pay for dispatch.
okay? So that would, I mean, for instance, in Sevier County, they give a contribution. The county government pays for dispatch, and it runs $700,000 or $800,000. Well, the 911 board contributes a couple of $100,000 to the general county fund for the operation of the dispatch center. So they would say that that's not the appropriate use.
Well, they encourage those agreements, so whatever's going to work best for that local area, if it means the local governments are going to contribute some and the district is also contributing, I don't think they would oppose that. I think they just support whatever's going to work for the locals.
Okay, but they do not oppose any use of dispatch funds any use of 911 funds for dispatch. They would say that if it's a cooperative effort, that would be okay.
I think so.
Okay, thank you.
Now, on that point, Mayor, and I asked them to pass out Representative Wargo's letter as the presentation was being made. He could not attend today and regrets that, but he wrote a letter, I guess it was yesterday, to us. And you can see in the, third paragraph from the bottom, Representative Wargo joins with MTAS and CTAS and also NASNA in stating his opposition to any 911 funds being so used. And that's just an issue that's out there still. The report itself doesn't reach a conclusion per se or recommend one way or another, just to confirm that for the record, but it highlights the issue. And it sounds to me as though it will be perhaps the subject of new legislation come January. I don't know if there are any questions or comments about that, but yes, sir. Mayor Greer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In Representative Wargo's letter, he brings up the issue that some communities, ECDs, that were charging 65 cents on the residential lines back in 2012 when the baseline was set, those communities are receiving possibly 10% less funds than they should have received under the formula. Is that because the additional money going into the state that is collected from that is being distributed to those ECDs that had the higher fees at the time of the 2012 study?
Well, any ECD that was done at the maximum rate by, I believe it was July 1st, 2011, could request a base amount increase, and all of the ECDs that were not at the maximum rate did request an increase to their base amounts and received those increases. So there was something in the law that took that into consideration, that accounted for that.
All right, any further discussion? Yes, sir. Mayor Huffman.
Thank you, Judge. Let me say, Jennifer, first of all, in your research and work on this, and thank you for all this, is bonded indebtedness or a 911 communication district that's issued debt. I don't know if any in Tennessee have, but if they issue debt, is that backed by the city or the county, or is that just backed by the revenue that they get from the state and local folks for the communication district itself? Is it a revenue bond they issue, or is it a bond? Is it indebtedness that's backed by the taxing authority of a municipality or a county?
I'm not sure about that, actually.
What I'm getting at is, Mr. Chairman, I don't know where this is going on, whether you can use 911 funding for dispatching or not. I know dispatching is vital to the whole system working together. Should we use 911 funding to fund dispatching? And if we don't, does that mean we're going to be using property taxes to fund dispatching? And is it fair to use surcharge money for folks that are using the 911 system to pay for it? Or is it fair to use money coming from just property owners to fund a system that everyone's going to be using? So those are some pretty, tough issues to have to think about. I would like to know if there's debt in the future, how that right now the statute reads or who's responsible for that, because I think if there are a number of county districts in Tennessee whose revenue numbers are going down after the latest change, they may be put in a position where they've got to issue debt for capital improvement projects that they in the past hadn't had to consider debt instruments for that, while they're trying to use their other revenue for these operational costs. And so those are just, that's more of an editorial than anything, Mr. Chairman.
No, it's good for the record. And Dr. Lippard, do you want to comment on that or follow up on what we'll do to get the information?
We will follow up and get a decisive answer. I'm getting text updates from staff in the audience that there are 5 ECDs that have revenue bonds. A number of them also have bank loans. But as far as who's ultimately on the hook for those, I would assume it'd be similar to utility districts where it's not the city or county that backs it, it's the district itself, but I don't know that for sure. So we'll get a definite answer for you.
Yes, sir, Mayor.
Thank you, sir. Just to follow up, do we know how many districts in Tennessee right now, after the law change, have revenue decreases rather than revenue increases, or status quo revenue? Do we have any idea how that looks?
Overall revenue, actually, I'm 33 were net negative.
33 were
33 were net negative in 2016 for that year.
all right.
So that's their net position. I'm not sure about the revenue numbers specifically, how many.
I guess that begs the question under the rules now, if the state rules, if that negative number continues after 2 or 3 years, then you guys come in and you say, wait a minute, you got to do something here. What are the options for the district in terms of fixing that?
I know that the TCB's policy has several options. I don't know if we don't. Their policy 6 outlines the procedure they would go through to address their financial situation, and they have various steps they take, and they're in that policy.
Yeah. Is there anything in the publication that we're looking at now that is considering for approval that addresses any of those issues?
Yes, and that policy is in the report as an appendix, and we do talk about it. And we summarize their process for determining who's distressed and then what they do to help them. But the details are all in that policy 6.
Mayor Biggers and then Mayor Waters.
And I'm struggling with what the objection to using the 911 dollars for dispatch is. As I view that the dispatching is perhaps one of the most critical links in emergency responding. I go back and I look at the list of permissible and impermissible uses of that revenue, but what's the argument why we focus on dispatch as opposed to simply allowing each community to decide what works best for that county and the municipalities within that county?
We do allow each community to decide what's going to work for them. Dispatch is a permissible use of 911 revenue, so it's fine to use the revenue that way. I think there's just different views on how that money should be used, and basically it just comes down to some stakeholders think that 911 revenue was never intended to pay for dispatch, but many disagree with that view.
I guess what I'm struggling with, what's the public policy reason for the opposition from CTAS and the others to using the monies in that way?
I mean, I think that their position is that local government, those agencies should be contributing to dispatch locally.
Mayor Waters and then Cliff.
And again, what my concern is I understand contributing. My concern is when I read that they're opposed to any funds at all going to it, and I think that should be a local decision based upon. I can understand if a 911 board is in the negative and is having financial difficulty, then that becomes an issue of priorities of what they're going to fund. And I can understand in that situation, you know, having to make some tough choices if dispatch is part of your funding. But if you're financially stable, and like in our county, they're contributing to the dispatch and contributing maybe 20 or 25% of the total, and the county is putting in the other 80%, I can't see why, I can't see the usefulness of somebody saying you can't do that just because it's against my philosophy to do that. I mean, if it's working for us, I don't understand why that somebody would say, well, you can't do that. You're financially in a good position, and they're contributing to 911. It's all an emergency response, and I'm having trouble understanding that aspect of it, and just express a concern about that.
Cliff, did you want to comment? And then we'll go to.
I just wanted to chime in, having worked on 4 or 5 of these reports on 911 in the past. As I recall, a lot of the original public policy philosophy behind not using the funds for dispatch, or not requiring that the funds be used for dispatch, and I think that's an important distinction. Not requiring them to be used for dispatch was that the original surcharge was put in place to pay for the technology improvements when we were first going to E911, enhanced E911, and all the improvements to make E911 respond to the shift from wireline to wireless service. So I think that was part of the argumentation. But again, I do want to stress that we don't recommend in the report that the funds not be permitted for dispatch. We just point out the issues, and currently it is a permissible use. And
Representative Carter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for those comments. I'm afraid I've been sitting here just lost as last year's Easter eggs. I don't know how, I'm like Mayor Waters, I don't know, wouldn't it appear if we banned the contribution that we would literally end up with 2 emergency response systems? One for the police and the fire, and one for 911. I think we need to leave this to the locals to figure out what's most efficient for their communities, rather than us sit up here and decree what's going to happen. So I'm just wondering, like Mayor Waters, is this just someone's philosophical opinion? Is there a state statute? Who at CTAS and MTAS is behind this?
Who is behind it?
Yeah, I mean, who's going to tell Mayor Waters what he can do and what he can't do?
There's nothing that says that the locals cannot use 911 revenue for dispatch. It is a permissible use, and we are saying in the report that it should be up to the locals to decide what works best for them. We're not suggesting changing that. And we just tried to present various viewpoints, and there is a lot of discussion and disagreement on how dispatch should be paid for. We weren't suggesting.
Maybe Dr. Lepard explained it best if I got it, which is rare. But if I got it, what the rule apparently does, it protects 911 from being required to do what the county or the city is now doing. In other words, it protects their funding to that extent, but it does allow an agreement between Mayor Waters and the group. Well, that might be the smartest way to do it, yeah. So the prohibition is not that it can't be used at all, it's that it can't all be used.
Right, so there are some required uses of 911 revenue, and those are in TCB's policies, their revenue standards. Once those required uses have been met, then there are some permissible uses, and dispatch is one of those permissible uses. There is no prohibition on using 911 revenue for dispatch.
Well, the locals may find a better way. I certainly hope they do than what we send them, so let's let them do what works best for them, would be my opinion. But I thank you, Dr. Cliff, for that. That explanation really helped me, so thank you.
Ken? Yes, sir. You're recognized.
I hope I'm not getting too far into the weeds, but I think might be able to shed some light on the dispatch issue. When a district is created, the voters have the right to decide one of three methods in which the calls will be answered or taken and answered. The first is the dispatch method. The second is the transfer, and the third is the relay method. So it would be hard to strictly prohibit any funds being used to pay for dispatch, because the dispatch method is one of the methods that's permitted under the law for a district to choose when it's created. And so I hope that doesn't get in the weeds, but I don't think there's anything that would prohibit the use of funding for dispatch, and that's why it is a permissible use. I think the important aspect is the technology has to be paid for first, and then the dispatchers, if a district wants to have dispatchers, they have that right.
Thank you for clarifying. That information is also in the report.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Young. Cliff reminds me that in an earlier report there was more discussion too about some of the difficulties with the relay system, and mind you, the 2014 legislation was designed to modernize and standardize equipment, and I think there was just some concern that attempted to be addressed by the way the language was written, that you might have some locals take the increased funding, those that had increases, and using them to offset what would otherwise be ordinary and normal expenses by the local government. So they were trying to make sure that what was being generated would go, in fact, in the first instance, to upgrade and modernize and standardize communications. But it's still a fuzzy area, and it'll be something I'm sure comes up in January and can be hashed out. And I think this report will help, if people will read it carefully, flesh out the important issues. And I appreciate the discussion. Is there other discussion about this at this point? All right, is there a motion that we approve the report as finalized here? Moved by Representative Carter and seconded by, thank you. All right, any further discussion? All in favor of approval of the report signify by saying aye. Any opposed or abstaining? All right, it's unanimously approved. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good job. Thank you, Ms. Berry. It's a lot of work, as usual. Just as is the next item behind tab 5, near and dear to many of our hearts, Mayor Biggers in particular, I think. This is the report on housing Tennessee's convicted felons, improving outcomes while balancing state and county needs. This is also a final report that will require our approval. And to present it today, once again, Bob Morio, Senior Research Associate. Bob, take it away.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Commissioners. My name is Bob Morio. I'm here to present for your approval our final report on the topic of housing Tennessee's state prisoners in county jails, located behind tab 5 in your books. Before I get to the report, we'd like to call your attention to some recent news articles we've included in your docket books, located between the memo and the report. Throughout the process of researching and writing this report, news reports like these have been a regular occurrence and a reminder of the many challenges facing the criminal justice system that go beyond the scope of this report. One story out of Scott County revealed problems with medical care and failed inspections, where one inmate died and others became seriously ill, according to 3 federal lawsuits filed. As of July 31st, there were 41 backup felons in that jail awaiting transfer to state prison. The second story reports that in June, Ray County was ordered by the state to eliminate its overcrowding problems. On April 30th, there were 200 inmates housed in a facility with 87 beds, and 43 were convicted felons. According to the sheriff, most inmates were in jail for drug charges or probation violations. The July 31st jail summary report shows the population has come down to 129, with 20 felons remaining. Although its population was double the given capacity at the time, the jail has remained certified by TCI since passing its last inspection in November of 2016. And Ray County is currently working to construct a larger new jail. The third story from Chatham County reports on their struggles to deal with overcrowding, and the sheriff and TCI officials quoted in the story cite their needs for drug rehab and reentry programs to keep people from coming back to jail after release, but note that they have no physical space for programming in their overcrowded jail. At our last meeting in May, I presented the first draft of the report for your review and feedback, and today I'll mostly address questions that came up at that time and what we've revised or added to the report, which will be highlighted in gray in your docket books. In general, the report recognizes that more than most other states, Tennessee relies on its county jails to house a significant number of convicted felons, and there are ways in which this puts a strain on county governments. However, it does save the state money, and many counties seem to be able to benefit from using state prisoners for labor and use reimbursement money from the state to offset most of the costs of housing them. While the report presents cost scenarios in which the state could raise reimbursement rates to counties across the board, we find that there isn't enough county-by-county cost data to determine if that is an appropriate solution, and moreover, that doing so wouldn't necessarily improve long-term outcomes for county governments, communities, or the prisoners. Instead, the report recommends easing the burden on counties through targeted spending increases by the state aimed at reducing recidivism and providing treatment solutions for offenders with drug problems and mental health issues. The recommendations are in bold type on pages 5 and 6 at the beginning of the report. First, we recommend that the state should expand support for the Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services Criminal Justice Liaison Program, which has been praised by state and local officials both. Since the draft was presented, we've added an estimate that doing so would require about $1.6 million annually to fund the additional staff needed statewide. Second, regarding the recommendation that beyond the simple reimbursement for costs, the state should provide additional incentives for counties to provide programs and services. We added more information about the way Kentucky's substance abuse treatment program works at a cost to that state of $9 per prisoner per day. We also included on pages 40 and 41 some more information from Dyer County, which was shared with us in December by Sheriff Box, who told us then that his basic education job training program costs about $5 per prisoner per day, and that his comprehensive reentry program costs about $16. Tennessee, as has been done in Kentucky, could offer funding assistance beyond the daily reimbursement rate to help counties implement programs proven to reduce recidivism, improve outcomes for prisoners and communities. The report also advises that implementing such programs and evaluating them would require improved data collection, the adoption of standardized programs, and development of measures of program success. And thirdly, because adequate oversight of local jails is necessary for the state to balance its need for fiscal responsibility with its responsibility for maximizing public safety and achieving the best possible prisoner outcomes, we recommend that the Tennessee Corrections Institute be given clearer legal authority to require local correctional facilities to comply with set standards, including authority for its Board of Control to recommend that the Tennessee Department of Correction remove state prisoners from non-certified jails when conditions warrant. As far as significant changes from the draft are concerned, after June 30th, nearly all of TDOC's contracts with the various counties expired and were up for renewal. So beginning on page 14, the report explains reasons that some of the contracts have not been renewed. One reason given is the requirement that contract counties must be certified in compliance with PREA, the Prison Rape Elimination Act. An Appendix E has been added to the report to explain this federal law and what it means for Tennessee. Essentially, states in their state prisons must comply with standards of this act in order to avoid losing federal grant money. So by extension, private entities and local governments that contract with states to house inmates are also required to comply. Some counties have decided that the costs of bringing their jails up to meet these standards is too cumbersome. Cock and Hamlin County jails had been under contract with TDOC, but since those facilities have not been certified by TCI, the state cannot sign a new contract with them. We note in the report that failing inspections does not mean that TDOC will cancel existing contracts, only that they cannot enter into new agreements. We also tried to better explain the way the reimbursement program changed in 1989, before which TCI certified facilities were reimbursed more than those that failed their certification. Since 1989, there's been no difference in the amount counties are reimbursed whether their jail is certified or not. Table 4 on page 22 of the report has been updated to reflect all the counties' contract status and reimbursement rates going forward into fiscal year 2017-18. After some of the discussion at the last meeting regarding the contract process, we go into greater detail here to explain how actual costs are used to determine reimbursement rates in the counties that are required to report their costs. On page 23, we also added additional information about the process for contract counties to be reimbursed for medical expenses above $1,000 per inmate. TDOC says that counties submit their claims in various ways, that TDOC reviews those claims as it receives them, and once verified that the expense is valid and has exceeded $1,000 as per their contracts, the department adds the necessary amount to the county's next monthly reimbursement payments. Much of the other additional information has, since the draft, is also about costs. Beginning on page 25, the report contains some estimates we did of what raising reimbursement rates to counties across the board might cost on an annual basis. If the state were just to set the reimbursement rate at $45 per prisoner per day, which is $6 more than this year's rate of $39, and close to what TDOC estimates the average cost to be, it would raise the estimated annual cost of reimbursements from about $139 million to $152 million, an increase of $13 million. The report also notes on page 26 that the estimated annual cost to reimburse counties for prisoners from the date of conviction rather than sentencing, as proposed by Senator Yeager and Representative Halsey, Senate Bill 678 and House Bill 182, was about $18.3 million. We explained that the increase would not affect reimbursements to Davidson and Shelby counties, who already receive higher amounts, and that the state is paying for those two counties to house more than a third of the felons in all county jails. Because of some of the questions regarding those counties' higher contract amounts, page 20 has some explanation that although contracts between the state and counties are not limited by the reimbursement cap set each year, the state has rarely agreed to exceed that amount. Later on page 39, we add some explanation that the state specifically contracted with these two counties to construct their large detention facilities, paying not only higher per diem amounts, but also reimbursing them for the cost of construction. These two facilities house a greater number of felons than any other county jail and are required to take inmates with sentences of up to 6 years instead of 3, and are also contractually obligated to provide higher levels of service than county jails. Because the statute authorizes TDOC to reimburse any county for debt service issued for the purpose of constructing facilities to contract with the state, there's no reason any other county couldn't propose building its own facility, but the decision to do so would depend on TDOC's needs to house additional felons. The report also uses data for prison construction costs to estimate what it would take to build and operate additional prison space instead of keeping felons in county jails. To move the state's roughly 4,500 backup prisoners who have been sentenced to serve time in prison, not county jail, to newly constructed prison facilities would cost an estimated $359 million in construction costs and an additional $61 million each year in higher operating costs. And there's a new graph on page 36 that shows how those increases would be different. Because of some confusion about whether counties are reimbursed for housing parole violators versus probation violators, on page 32 you'll find an explanation of how those two terms are different. Felons out on parole have already served a required portion of their sentence in prison or jail, and counties are reimbursed for housing accused parole violators while they await a hearing. Felons on probation have been sentenced to probation instead of prison, and counties are not reimbursed for housing prisoners who await probation violation hearings. Ultimately, the recommendations presented in the draft report remained unchanged. Continuing to improve prisoner assessment and data collection will enable TDOC and counties to work together to target limited resources towards the most effective programs and facilities. Simply increasing reimbursement rates to counties or reimbursing them for more days may seem fair, but there isn't enough county-by-county cost data reported to determine if that is the case across the board. Moreover, it won't necessarily improve long-term outcomes for county governments, communities, or offenders. While the state is saving money by keeping felons in county jails rather than state prisons, most jails are not able to provide the same level of programming for mental health, substance abuse, education, among other services available in prisons. This leads to higher rates of recidivism for felons released from jails, which contributes then to the burden on county sheriffs and their jails from people returning. Since additional prisons are perhaps the most expensive response to the problem, the state should work to improve prisoner outcomes while reducing the burden on local governments by supporting existing state programs and creating these financial incentives for counties to provide the prisoners with same or similar services that they would receive in state prisons. And lastly, to achieve these desired outcomes, the state needs to improve oversight and compliance with its standards and build upon the steps taken in recent years towards stakeholder collaboration, best practices, and new approaches to the management and coordination of state and local correctional facilities. That concludes my presentation, and I welcome any questions you have, but otherwise submit the report for your approval.
Okay. Mayor Biggers. Yes, sir.
Let me just acknowledge the outstanding work that went into this report. I can remember when some of the elected officials in my county gathered, the biggest challenge we faced in trying to decide how to address the issue was a lack of information and a lack of data. And your wonderful work on this goes a long way in solving that problem. Couple of things I want to make sure that as I listen to what you talked about in the report is that if we were to increase, the conclusion in the report is that if we take the TDOC's estimate of $45 a day and the legislature makes that the new rate, that would have a cost of $13 million.
Yeah, it's basically, napkin math of, going from 30, those that are already receiving 39, if you were to bump them up to 45 and figure how many, about how many prisoners they've got, that would be the additional cost.
And if we were to include those that have been convicted but not yet sentenced, who are felons who are incarcerated in county jails until they're sentenced, that would be another $18 million approximately.
Yeah, the fiscal note.
Additional cost to the state.
The fiscal note on that bill was just, but for cases where there's time between sentencing or between conviction and sentencing, would be about $18 million.
And the other thing that I'm not sure you touched on, I want to make sure I understand is, it looks like the research indicates that recidivism rates are much higher for inmates that are housed in jails versus those that are housed in state facilities by significant percentages.
Yeah, those were TDOC studies, and for similar felons that were being released from a prison versus those coming out of a jail, the recidivism rate was higher when they were coming out of jails.
And would it be the staff's conclusion doing this research that that's because many of the programs that are available to inmates in the state system that may help reduce recidivism are not available to the inmates housed in the jails?
Yeah, that seems to be what those studies show.
So that would indicate that if our goal is deterrence, to keep them from committing other crimes, we're better off getting them housed in the state facilities, or we need to spend the money to make sure that similar programs exist in the county facilities for those being housed there.
Right, that's where it might be cost effective to, the whole idea of keeping, some offenders locally in county jails isn't a bad idea, but providing that additional service might be more cost effective than building a new prison and sending them there for treatment.
And maybe this is getting too simple for me, but if the goal wasn't reducing recidivism and isn't improving that rate by investing in the programs ultimately going to reduce in a lower felon population and thus an overall lower economic impact on both the state and the counties?
Yes, that's the plan.
Again, thank you. I appreciate, in my view, y'all did just an outstanding work on this, and I extend that to all the staff that worked on it.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Mayor Bickers. I've got Representative Parkinson, then Mayor Huffman, and Senator Yarbrough.
Thank you, sir, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mayor. Mayor, you took some of my questions right out of my head. I'm going to go back and just kind of piggyback on what the mayor was talking about in regards to recidivism, and so we've come to the conclusion that in the report that is due to the lack of the similar programming that the state offers that these county jails are not offering, and it's causing a higher recidivism rate, right?
That's what the
Okay, now my question is, and I don't know if the report talks about this, but do we talk about in the report anywhere in regards to what those violations are that would cause them to come back into the prison? Are they technical violations that did we?
They would, not for the purpose of our report. We just looked at just the big picture. Those are TDOC recidivism studies that are lengthy and go into a lot of detail. So there may be a lot more information in there to answer that question.
Okay. The other question I had is you mentioned also $1.6 million to for mental health, and how would that help to offset the prison population? Can you explain that just a little bit more?
Sure. What that is, the Criminal Justice Liaison Program basically intervenes with people that need, that have mental health or substance abuse issues when they're brought into the justice system. It attempts to keep them out of jail from the beginning, or they work on reentry plans and trying to do some post-jail follow-up. So they have case managers, caseworkers that work with those individuals. And right now, according to the department, they're only able to cover 32 counties. A lot of that's in East Tennessee and scattered across the rest of the state. So what we're saying is if you wanted to get case managers and caseworkers to cover the rest of the state, we work with them to come up with an estimate of about $1.6 million to fund the additional staff to do that.
Right. And is there a measurement of how that would help to offset the population at all, or is that?
They've got, I'd have to look at, I have to find it in the report, but when we had Ellen Abbott, we had the department talk about that program at our panel in December. She mentioned, thousands of people that they've worked with to keep them from going to jail in the first place, that they've intervened with. They do a lot of outreach, and they've got several hundred, if not a couple thousand, post-release work plans to monitor those people after they go back into the community. So they've definitely got some numbers to back up their program.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mayor Huffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When you were looking at other states and what they're doing to improve operating efficiency in local jails or overcrowding in either the state level or the local level, in Tennessee, the governor, after I think capacity in the state system gets over 95%, the law gives him the authority, kicks in some safety valve functions powers that he has to help with overcrowding. On the local level in Tennessee, I don't think there's anything like that in existence. I don't think local sheriffs or local county mayors have any additional authority, regardless of whether you're at 98% or whether you're at 50%. Did you come across any of the other states around Tennessee where there is some local authority in the law after you get to a certain capacity, over a certain capacity, where local officials have some additional options that they can use to help reduce overcrowding?
I can't say that we came across anything like that. I mean, basically, for Tennessee, it comes down to sort of a basic constitutional mandate that the county is responsible to take in anyone who's arrested, and it's the sheriff's job. It's the county's job to have a jail, and the sheriff's job to take in whomever is brought to them. If you've got room for them or not, you got to figure out a way to do something about it, and that's just sort of that basic level of responsibility. Now, we didn't see anything in any of the other states that would give the local authorities some sort of relief valve like that.
Senator Yarborough.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to echo, I believe, the mayor's compliments for the work, because it's really hard to process this. What the right thing to do is when you don't have the information. It's very helpful to have the information, and I mean, I think here we actually learn a lot because we all live in Tennessee. We sort of think that this, whatever we're doing, is the norm, and I think this report highlights that, housing between a quarter and a third of our, state prison population in county jails is unusual by comparison. And while it's cheaper, it does come at least some cost, in the sense of there's a burden on counties in trying to work with this, and there's inherently some limitations in our ability to kind of have policies that are applicable for all state prisoners. And so, and I mean, I think it's also really interesting that you see the something concrete in that, in seeing differences in recidivism. And when I was thinking about the cost comparison, do we have any information about, so if we're operating at a place where you could, I mean, I think the difference in recidivism rates is 13%, 18% in one and 31% in the other. Do we have a sense of what the economic impact of lowering that rate would be? And because I think that's, if you're thinking about, the construction's obviously the big deal issue, then there's annual cost differences which are much smaller, but I'm sort of curious as to whether any analysis was done on how recidivism rates and lowering them to where, if we got our full population to the state, to the TDOC average, what that ends up doing on a cost basis.
I'd say that level of analysis was not something that was really part of our initial scope. I mean, it was a struggle throughout this to try to keep things on the focus of, the state prisoner, the reimbursement, the county jail. There are so many other aspects you can go into in greater detail. That would be one that's certainly worth looking at, I think.
Thank you, Senator Yarborough. I also want to acknowledge that Senator Yeager, Chairman of State and Local Government, has joined us, and this is a topic of particular interest to him. We have also had some discussions on the Senate State and Local Government Committee about this issue, and in particular those local governments that are engaged in various reentry, recidivism programs. And I think we'd all been a little hopeful that perhaps in the first half of the 110th session just concluded that there might be some incentive-based legislation for those entities that are working hard to reduce recidivism and have robust reentry programs, that there might be some compensation for that sort of thing. And I'm sure that it'll be looked at again in the second half of the session come January. Yes, Representative Carter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Having been the attorney in Roberts versus Hamilton County and spent years in these matters, they're still near and dear to my heart and more difficult every day. I thought we had troubles then. I just didn't look far enough down the line. Here's my question. When you examine the county jail for recidivism, do you pull out the mental health patients from that determination? Is it simply state sentenced felons?
I would have to go back and look at the TDOC report. It was, it's their analysis, one versus the other.
Yeah, let me tell you what my problem is. I'm working with a group. I met with a group in Chattanooga that's been working with a group in Charlotte. Our jail is 353 capacity, I believe now, 220 mental patients in the jail. Those people are constantly in and out of jail. They can't. We are imprisoning people with mental health issues. I went to public school, so that's why I'm so dumb in this area. I thought that ended in the Middle Ages, but apparently it doesn't. So Hamilton County is discussing building a new jail at $75 million, when 40% of that jail is a mental institution. It's not a jail to begin with. These people committed no crime whatsoever. So how do we take them into a jail situation where there is now there is training for the guards to deal with a mental illness, and I understand all that. But we need those people to be in a place where they can receive treatment. These are not criminals. They have an illness. And so that's my pet peeve, and that's why I agreed to serve on the committee there. It's going to do us no good to build jails. If we're going to have to build jails to house mental health patients, we're going to have a medical wing, and it just seems ridiculous to me. I know that Charlotte, Mecklenburg County, according to their statistics, 3 years ago spent $1.2 million and built residential housing for those repeat mental health patients. As of 2 weeks ago Wednesday, when I met with them, they had 93 empty beds in their local jail. So until we deal with the mental health issue, I don't think we're going to be able to deal with overcrowding in the local jail. Now, finally, my question, as I posed it to a group of lawyers last week, whose responsibility are those mental health patients? Is that a state responsibility? It is a state law that requires them to be housed. I did it for 9 years. If there's nowhere to put them, if they're a danger to themselves or others, certified by 2 physicians, you lock them up until a state bed becomes available. Sessions court judges up to 15 days. Thereafter, a circuit or chancery court judge has to hold them. I understand that average stay is 2 years. Until we divide this, we're not going to be able to conquer it because we're dealing with mental health as a crime. And I just don't see the future in that. So I got a call last night from the county mayor telling me that he had met with that group and had understood. They're examining that now. I think a tax increase was announced for Hamilton County today, and a part of that is a 72-bed residential facility for these people who check out of the jail one day and as soon as the medication wears off, generally 5 to 7 days, are back. And so we have to stop that. So I'm not questioning, I'm lecturing, I apologize. But my question is, if we're counting everyone that leaves the jail that comes back as recidivism, we're getting very skewed numbers. Does that make sense to you? Yeah. The state prison doesn't have to deal with that. They send their mental health people to other places. And as a representative of the sheriff for 19 years, that's a very difficult position to put him in. One, he's neither trained nor equipped to accomplish. So I hope that at some point the state legislature will look at the mental health crisis, and it is definitely a crisis, and see if we can figure some way to do that and give the locals some help in that regard. Thank you.
Well said, Mayor Waters.
This is as everyone knows, this is a very, very complex issue that we're dealing with here. One of the issues, and I don't know if you all looked at this any, one of the big problems that we have is pretrial detainees. We've got such a backlog that's waiting to get to trial, and so many times, even in our general sessions court, by the time they do get to trial, they've been in jail longer than their sentence is, so they let them out. These folks can't make bond. They're sitting over there in jail, and we really don't know how to address that particular issue. The other thing is, in addition to the mental illness, is our opioid problem, which is a big problem I know each of us have. And what happens with those folks is you can't, or we can't send them to a rehab usually. So what we're doing is we're keeping them over there for 9 months or 12 months or however long it is, and then they go back out in the community, get back with the same crowd, and in 3 months they're right back in our facility. So we're recycling these folks as well, and that is such a problem because that cycle is so difficult to break. I mean, we meet on it constantly, but no one has figured out a foolproof way other than them moving away from the area. That seems to be the only thing that works, is them moving away from their friends to where they can't get back in that cycle. So that is causing a continual overcrowding problem in our jail. We double the size, and then we build just a few years ago, a third more, and we're full again. And that the other issue that comes with that is the cost involved prevents us from trying some of these programs that we're talking about to help these folks, because we're constantly struggling just to try to house these folks and expand our facility and figure out how we can constantly pushing up against that maximum number. So you can't sit there and figure out, well, how am I going to help these folks? You're spending all your time trying to figure out, how am I going to just house them, and how am I going to keep from getting decertified, because we're pushing up against that wall again that we have. So it's a very, very complex problem. I don't know the answer to it, but I certainly know that this pretrial business is one issue, and the opioid problem is another big issue that we're having. And it goes along with what Representative Carter's talking about, the mental health issues. So we're trying to do so many things in these correctional facilities. We're trying to rehab them off drugs. We're trying to deal with mental illness. We're trying to deal with all these things in addition to the criminal element we got, that it makes the folks that operate the jail, it makes their job almost impossible. That was more of a statement than a question, though.
No objection. No, it's all very timely and topical, and still needs to be addressed. But I think this update will facilitate that to a large extent. There's some things like mental health and opioids, and also, we've got the hepatitis problem in our inmate population so much, which was a big cost in this year's budget. But anyway, I hope this will be helpful. Any other questions or comments or concerns? And if not, I'll entertain a motion that we approve the report, moved by Mayor Huffman, seconded by Mayor Bickers. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor signify by saying aye. Any opposed or abstaining? That's great. Bob, thank you. The report is unanimously approved. We appreciate your hard work.
Thank you all.
Sure do. Well, we just moved right along here to the update on the issue of boat titling. This is, you can sort of blame me or some of my constituents for floating the issue. How should we put it? Behind tab 6. It's it's one of those things that I'm not sure top of mind for many people, but as you will hear, it is something that needs to be addressed. Cliff?
And I'll just add, and I think any of the staff would agree, this is another one of those issues when we first got the study. It's like, oh, this will be a fun little study. And all these issues, when you start digging into them, there's always a lot more layers and a lot more issues than you think they're going to be. So, and Nathan has got to enjoy those.
And before Nathan goes, I'll tee it up a little bit. There was a story year before last about I think a victim at Pickwick, I think it was a houseboat. Forgive me if they're listening in, but I didn't review all the facts about it. But the boat had been stolen and resold a number of times, and it's something I hadn't thought of at the time. Actually was brought to my attention by Jenny DiPrizio, who is a newswoman with Channel 24 in West Tennessee, and who also has a nice watercraft at Pickwick. And having raised the issue, we considered legislation shortly thereafter, but it raised some collateral issues, if you will. Cost, how big of a boat, what size watercraft are we talking about? Is this some kind of revenue raising scheme to bilk the taxpayers? And of course it's not that, but what we found is the concept has been pretty well received. If you can title these larger watercraft to protect against theft and that sort of thing. So tell us where you are on it right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon, Commission members. My name is Nathan Shaver, and I'm here to provide a brief update on the boat titling project. If you'll turn to tab 6 of your docket books, you'll find a memo explaining some of the research that we've found so far. The current plan for this study is to have a draft report to you at the next commission meeting in December. So today I'll briefly talk about the motivation behind the study, the current state and federal laws, prior Tennessee boat titling legislation, other states' boat titling systems, some of the asserted benefits of boat titling, and model legislation on boat titling from the Uniform Law Commission. As you'll recall, Public Chapter 179 was passed this year by the General Assembly, directing TACIR to study the creation and implementation of a boat titling system for Tennessee, which is one of the 13 states that does not have a boat titling system. As Chairman Norris mentioned, the motivation from this study stems in part from a 2015 incident in which a Pickwick Lake area boat dealer fraudulently sold the same boats to multiple people. According to court records, the illegal scheme resulted in over $500,000 in total property loss, with 12 reported victims. Some of the victims believe that a boat titling system in Tennessee could have prevented this situation. To give you some background, in general, a certificate of title is a legal document issued by the state for a one-time fee and is used to authenticate ownership and note any liens. Registration, on the other hand, is imposed on a vehicle or a boat operator as a recurring fee and is required for the lawful use of the public roads or waterways maintained by the state. The rationale for requiring boat titling and registration is comparable to the rationale for requiring motor vehicle titling and registration. So now we'll go over some of the current law related to this study. All 50 states, is required by federal law, have a boat registration system. The Tennessee Wildlife Resource Agency, known as TWRA, administers our state's boat registration system, including the processing of boat registration applications. Tennessee law requires all motorized and cell-powered boats principally used in the state to be registered. And for the initial boat registration, an application form is obtained from either a county clerk's office or from the boat dealer who sold the boat. TWRA will not register the boat unless sales tax payment is certified on the registration application by county clerk or the dealer. The boat registration application is formally called an application for boat certificate of number, is the applicant receives a registration number along with a validation decal that must be affixed to both sides of the boat. Page 23 of the memo at the end provides a visual of the validation decal and numbers that are affixed to registered boats, and probably look familiar to anyone that's been out on the lake. In 2016, there were over 254,000 registered boats in Tennessee. Attachment B on page 22 of the memo shows the types and numbers of boats registered in Tennessee, broken down by length of the vessel and type of vessel. Tennessee's boat registration fees are shown on a table on page 3. These fees vary based on the length of the vessel and the duration of the registration period. In general, the bigger the boat, the higher the registration fee is. In Tennessee, boats can be registered for 1, 2, or 3-year periods. An interesting point of note is that Tennessee does not regulate boat dealers, while our state does regulate motor vehicle dealers and RV dealers, who must meet several minimum requirements to be licensed in Tennessee. If you'll turn to page 4 of the memo, there's a chart showing the requirements for motor vehicle and RV dealers compared to the lack of requirements for boat dealers. For example, a used car dealer must have a $50,000 surety bond and a $300,000 liability insurance policy. That car dealer would have to pay dealer licensing fees and complete an extensive 11-page application. Also submit any felony conviction records with their application to the Motor Vehicle Commission. Approximately 18 states, from what we've seen so far, regulate boat dealers similar to motor vehicle dealers. So as Chairman Norris mentioned earlier, one of the issues that led to this study was that a victim of the Pickwick Lake boat dealer scam was not allowed to recover his boat later from the subsequent buyer. That buyer had purchased the boat in the ordinary course of business from the fraudulent boat dealer. And according to Tennessee Code Annotated 47-2-403, Section 2, which comes from the Uniform Commercial Code, it states that any entrusting a possession of goods to a merchant who deals in goods of that kind gives them power to transfer all rights of the entruster to the buyer in the ordinary course of business. So this law makes a distinction between the merchants and non-merchants to protect the good faith buyers who purchase it from the merchant. So Section 2 of this law is known as the Merchant Entrustment Rule and addresses the specific situation where a person entrusts something, such as a boat, to a merchant who deals in goods of that kind, and then that merchant later sells the entrusted item to a good faith buyer in the ordinary course of business, even if that merchant did not have permission from the owner to sell it. This is the situation that happened at Pickwick Lake. For example, a victim purchased a boat from the boat dealer and agreed to allow the boat dealer to maintain possession of the boat for storage purposes, and the boat dealer then fraudulently sold that same boat to another unsuspecting good faith buyer. And under Tennessee law, that person is now the rightful owner of the boat. That said, while a boat titling requirement in Tennessee may have made this fraudulent scheme more difficult to accomplish, it's not clear that it would have prevented it from occurring. So now I'll briefly discuss the related federal law and an alternative to boat titling for larger boats. Under federal law, owners of large recreational boats that are 5 net tons in volume or greater may obtain what's known as a federal documentation, or also known as a certificate of documentation with the United States Coast Guard. According to the experts, boats that are at least 26 feet or more in length are large enough to meet the 5 net tons in volume size requirement. In fact, in order to receive a loan, some of the lending institutions require federal documentation for those larger recreational boats that are large enough to qualify. The lenders require the federal documentation because it is currently the only way to receive what's known as a preferred mortgage, which is a maritime lien that has priority over other liens in the event of a default. The recreational boats that are federally documented cannot be required to be titled by a state. Many of the states, including Tennessee, can and do require those boats to be registered, however, with the state. And while federal documentation of boats is a potentially useful alternative to boat titling, it is only available to a small percentage of Tennessee boats because of the size requirements to qualify. As of December 2016, according to TWRA boat registration statistics, of the 254,000 registered boats in Tennessee, only 4% of those boats were even large enough to be eligible for federal documentation. And according to the U.S. Coast Guard, only 1% of Tennessee boats are actually federally documented with their hailing ports listed in Tennessee. So the Tennessee legislature has considered boat titling laws in the past. Since 1995, the Tennessee legislature has considered but has not passed 6 bills regarding boat titling. The prior legislation varied in the scope of boats required to be titled, the state agency charged with administration, the titling fee, and whether or not titling would be mandatory or optional. Page 7 of the memo is a table that gives information about the prior boat titling bills. So what are some of the purported benefits of boat titling? TACIR staff has spoken with many of the stakeholders regarding the pros and cons of boat titling. In general, boat titling is widely supported among the many stakeholders that we've interviewed. Implementation of a mandatory boat titling system is widely favored over an optional titling system by the stakeholders in 36 of the 37 states that title boats. The stakeholders say that optional titling could create confusion among lenders and buyers regarding which boats have titles and could potentially cause problems with perfecting a security interest in the boat. In general, proponents argue that boat titling provides many benefits for a relatively small one-time fee. They recommend it to provide the owner legally sufficient proof of ownership. They recommend it to potentially reduce financing costs and conform the process for obtaining and perfecting a security interest in a Tennessee boat to that for motor vehicles by noting the lien on the title instead of the current method of filing a UCC-1 financing statement. They recommend it to deter thieves from using the state as a dumping ground for boats stolen from other states that do title boats. They recommend it to improve recovery of stolen boats by establishing a paper trail via the title that proves ownership. They recommend it to reduce fraud perpetrated against insurance companies and thereby potentially reducing insurance premiums. And they recommend it to help prevent Tennesseans from unwittingly purchasing a stolen vessel. The downsides to boat titling are that it is an additional cost for the consumer and that it could be a potentially burdensome task to obtain a title if the administrative process is not developed properly. 36 states require boat titling, and one state, Mississippi, allows for optional boat titling. Page 9 of the memo provides a color-coded map of the state's boat titling law. Among the 37 states that have a boat titling system, there is considerable variation in the scope of the titling laws. including which types of boats are required to be titled and which state entity is responsible for the administration of the system. If you'll turn to page 12, you'll see a table that includes all 50 states' boat registration and titling requirements, the scope of the boat titling laws, and the boat titling fees for each of those states. Some of the states list specific criteria, such as the length of the boat and the power of the engine to describe those boats that must be titled. 17 of the states require any boat that is required to be registered to also be titled. A table on page 10 shows that boat titling fees also vary among the states, ranging from a fee of $2 in Maryland to a $60 fee in New Jersey. And there is model legislation for boat titling that was developed by the Uniform Law Commission back in 2011. In the last few years, 2 states, Virginia and Connecticut, have passed versions of this model law, which is called the Uniform Certificate of Title for Vessels Act, which has been touted as regulating the titling of boats in a similar manner to the way that all states now regulate titles for automobiles. And the model law also establishes title branding, which is promoted as a way to protect consumers by requiring disclosure of the boat's title on the boat's title of any damage that affects the vessel's integrity. So that concludes my presentation. The next step for this study will be a draft report at the next commission meeting in December. I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Senator Tracy.
Interesting report. It's a lot of information there that we were just looking at. Looks like depending, what was the, I didn't look it up, what was your ideal, what would be the charge for titling a boat? Did you have an...
We don't have any recommendations about what
are the other states doing around us close?
It varies. I would say the average is probably somewhere around $10 or $15, but it goes everywhere from $2 to $60, and some states have a schedule based on the size of the boat. So it varies a good bit.
Yeah, and it looks like the county clerk would get a percentage of that, you know, to do the work, which a fee, which would help pay that. Then you start moving down the path of titling, and then the next thing is, so what are you going to do about liability insurance? Do you make it mandatory to have liability insurance if you're going to be on the water? I mean, it's just a thought. You're moving down that path. We've been doing it with cars for a long time, motorcycles for a long time. You know, you're traveling on water with a boat. It is a definitely can injure some folks, no question. So we've had several presented, but we've never moved forward on any legislation.
Yes, sir. That's what I've seen as well. And I haven't dug into the insurance requirement, but I've looked briefly, and I believe 2 states do require insurance for boat operators. But other than that, we haven't really looked into that aspect.
No, thank you for the report.
Mayor Bickers.
As you look at the report, one thing you might consider looking at is the impact on titling and protecting purchasers of boats that are subject to a lien. I've had several clients over the years who bought a boat, and these days they cost some of them as much as a car, and they end up being financed. They buy the boat, they don't appreciate that they need to check with the state on a UCC1, and next thing they know, some bank's calling them saying you owe the note on this boat. And it may be that if we require titling, as with a car, that note or lien would be noted on the title so that they could be protected. And I'm not sure, I would notice the UCC provision on, you know, if you buy it from the entrustment doctrine, but I don't know if that may protect, you know, what does that do with the buyer who buys from a boat dealer in the ordinary course in good faith, but the boat has a lien on it? Does that, I mean, he gets to keep the boat from the person who had it stolen, but it probably doesn't protect him from the lien that somebody in the line had put on the boat. So anyway, I think that might be a benefit in protecting people from unsuspecting purchasers from those liens if we did require titling, and it might be something to discuss in maybe a little more depth in your report. Thanks.
Absolutely.
Great comments. Yes, sir, Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In your report here, since the gatekeepers of this potential legislation would be our county clerks, what has been your discussion with the county clerks, and what is their opinion with regard to this?
I believe Kelly Jackson's actually here today, but they've been very helpful in the process with this study, and I believe they're ready to help in any way they can.
Thank you.
That's interesting. I detected a little competition between various officials and departments as to who might. Just a heads up in case I'm not around. Hate to miss it. Thank you, Nathan. That's great. It's good work, and I've heard from my constituent in West Tennessee who will be following this even more closely. I'd neglected to give a heads up that this was on for discussion today, but we'll be back in December. The issue will, anyway. Before we adjourn for the day, Mr. Cardwell wanted to make a special introduction, and he is recognized for that purpose.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to introduce to you today Rodney Archer. Rodney is succeeding the late Jay West as Executive Director of COPE. Rodney is from Anderson County. He served the last 11 years as trustee. I asked Rodney why would he give up a trustee position to be the director of COPES. He never gave me an answer, but we are glad to have Rodney as our executive director. Rodney?
You're welcome, sir. Rodney, would you like to say a word
Thank
or two? Come on, don't be shy. We're a little ahead of schedule. We'd love to hear from you if you'd like to address us. Congratulations, and we look forward to working with you. You're recognized.
Thank you. Again, it's Rodney Archer. I'm from Anderson County. I spent 11 years as trustee, 4 years on the county commission prior to that. I'm excited to be a part of the County Officials Association and look forward to working with each of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Rodney. Thank you. Yes, sir. Mr. Cardwell.
Also, I'd like to recognize Kelly Jackson. She's our president-elect for this ensuing year. Kelly's a county clerk in Montgomery County.
Kelly, welcome. Thank you for being here. Thank you all very much. All right, is there anything further for the good of the order this afternoon? Look forward to seeing each and every one of you, commission members and staff. Not all staff are here, but a little reception over at the City Club at 5 o'clock. Thank you. If there's nothing further, we'll adjourn till 8:30 a.m. Wednesday next. Is that how we put it in the Senate?